Today I'm in Disney's California Adventure and I want to talk about exposure fundamentals, and today I'm talking about shutter speed. Shutter speed is probably the most important setting you need to understand if you want to make better images or control what's going on in your image. If you have images that are coming out too blurry or too dark, one of the first things you might try adjusting is your shutter speed. So cameras need light in order to operate. The light is going to enter your camera through the lens. It's actually going to go through a hole in your lens, and your shutter speed is just a way of controlling how long that hole in your lens stays open. If it stays open for a long time, it's going to let in more light to hit the sensor. If it stays open for a very short time, it's only going to let in a little bit of light. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, like 1/1000. This means the shutter is open for only 1/1000th of a second. A short shutter speed is going to freeze motion. If you speed up the shutter speed, you will freeze action because you're capturing a smaller moment in time. The downside is that's not letting in a whole lot of light. A shutter speed fast enough to freeze motion is not going to let in enough light, so your image, it'll be sharp, but it'll be dark. So maybe your image is coming out too dark now, and so you select a longer shutter speed. You start going to a 60th of a second, a 30th of a second, a 10th of a second, slower and slower and slower, and yeah, you're gonna let in a lot more light. But now that the shutter is staying open that long, the things in your frame, if they're moving, they might start to blur. The faster the things move in your frame, the faster of a shutter speed you need. If things in your frame are not moving, like if you're doing landscape photography, you might be able to get away with that. So a lot of it comes down to what you want to see in your particular scene and how much ambient light you have to work with. So now we're going to go through a couple of examples. Okay, so let's head over to Pixar Pier and shoot some photos on the Incredicoaster and see how changing our shutter speed can affect the look of our photo. And let's try to get something that looks cool, because now if we understand shutter speed, we can control the flow of time. The magnetic launch is a pretty fun thing to use for experimenting with shutter speed and learning about shutter speed and seeing what speeds work to slow or blur certain moving things. Every situation is going to be different, so you got to go out and experiment with this stuff and try to find what works for your camera and your subjects and your environment. So the first thing we shot was the magnetic launch at 1/30th of a second, and you can see that there is some motion blur there. You can't really see people's faces. The cars are blurry. The water spraying up on the side is blurry. So then I increased my shutter speed from a 30th of a second to 1/1000th of a second, increasing it several times and freezing a much shorter moment in time on the sensor. And you can see in the 1,000th of a second image, the people are very crisp, people's faces are very crisp, the sides of the car are very crisp. You can see the water shooting up on the side is in much sharper focus. Here's another example, a kind of an extreme example on each side. A shot at an 8,000th of a second as they're going up into the tunnel, a very short slice of time to capture a very sharp photograph. And then I slowed the shutter all the way down to 1/2 of a second. That's leaving it open for a long time. And here you can see, you can barely see the car at all. So if you leave your shutter open long enough, things in your frame that move might actually disappear or become transparent as they move through the scene in front of other things that don't move. So that's kind of a cool effect you can use at night to blur people out of a scene. I use that quite often. I'll do a tutorial on how to do that in a future video. So we've looked at a few examples of what a fast shutter speed can do for your scene and what a slow shutter speed can do for your scene. But how do you know which to choose and where to start if you're new to this. If you've seen any recommendations online or any photography book that was written in the last 100 years, probably recommends something called the inverse focal length rule or the 1 over focal length rule. And this is a rule of thumb, and the idea is that whatever the focal length of your lens is, your shutter speed should be 1 over that. So if you have a 50mm lens, the lowest shutter speed you should use to avoid motion blur from hand shakiness is 1/50th of a second. If you have a 200mm lens, that you need to increase that to a 200th of a second, because the more magnification you have with your lens, the more motion blur and hand tremor it's going to magnify, and that's going to show up in your images. The farther out you're zoomed, you can have a little motion blur. It's a little harder to notice. So if the fastest shutter speed you can get is something really slow, you can maybe switch to a wider angle lens if you have one, and you can get away with that shutter speed. If you're using a lot of magnification, you need to either use a fast shutter speed or put your camera on something sturdy to take that motion blur out. There are a few things that make that old 1 over focal length rule maybe not obsolete, but less relevant than it used to be. A lot of cameras now have image stabilization, where the camera sensor or the camera lens, there's something mechanical or digital that is taking that handshake out of the equation. And so in some of those cases, you can get away with a slower shutter speed than you normally would. But all that goes out the window when you're shooting things that move. And when we're here in the theme park, we're on dark rides, I shoot a lot of things that move. I'm on a moving ride vehicle. And so the 1 over focal length rule doesn't really apply on dark rides. I find that on dark rides, about a 100th of a second is the minimum if the ride vehicle is moving. A 1/20th or a 1/60th or even a 200th is even better if your camera can still process that low light level. So now we're going to head over to Mike and Sully, which is a dark ride, and we're going to look at what shutter speeds work and what shutter speeds don't work in a dark ride where you have to balance a few things. There's not a lot of light. Common sense would say longer shutter speed to get a good exposure, but you're on a moving vehicle and the targets are moving past you, so you need a faster shutter speed to blur that motion out. So I find that about a 1/60th to a 200th of a second works really, really well on these rides. We're going to try to go lower and see what it looks like. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
So for this first scene, I used 1/100th of a second for my shutter speed, and because I'm moving straight towards this subject, I got a decent amount of speed, so you can see the detail in the hair, the detail in the eyelid was sufficient for this shutter speed. But as I round the corner, now the subject of Sully and the kid on the right, Sully's covered in fur, and so even though I increased my speed to 1/160th of a second, you can still see there's not as much detail in the fur as I would like, and motion blur gets mixed up with noise and it's not very aesthetic. Here with this shot, there's no hair, so 1/160 was enough to capture again the details in the scales and in the dress and in the background. So 160 to me is kind of my sweet spot. Slower, I can get results, but at 160, I can usually get results. Again, here the shot of Randall, not a lot of fine detail, but a lot of texture, a lot of subtle shading, and 160 was enough to freeze that in a very satisfactory way.
I'm hoping to make this sound easy, but it's not as easy as it might initially sound. It's not as easy as just, oh, I need to freeze motion, fast shutter speed, done. Or I want to blur motion, slow shutter speed, done. If you slow down your shutter speed, you're letting more light into your scene, and now your scene might be too bright. What do you do then? You're going to have to use something else to compensate. The easiest one to do is your aperture. If you're opening your shutter speed to let in more light and now your scene is too bright, you can then close down your aperture to restrict that light back down to a normal exposure. Conversely, if your scene is too dark because you need a fast shutter speed, now you need to open your aperture as wide as you can, or you might have to increase your ISO to make your camera more sensitive to that low light situation that you've created. It's all about balance. It's all about compromise. So if you need a fast shutter speed, you also need either a fast aperture or a high ISO or a lot of ambient light in your scene If you're stressed out about having to select your shutter speed manually and potentially messing up your images or having to take a long time to figure things out, there's a cheat code that most cameras have built in, and it's called shutter priority mode. Or on some cameras, you might see it referred to as time value mode. It's a setting on your dial. It'll say T or TV or S. And when you put your camera in that mode, what the camera will do is it will allow you to select whatever shutter speed you want, and the camera will automatically make the other adjustments for you. So if you are opening up your shutter speed, creating a longer exposure because you want to blur some water, but now that's making your image too bright, the camera will automatically detect that, and it will compensate by closing down your aperture the appropriate amount. The camera might also compensate by increasing or decreasing your ISO if you have your ISO set to an automatic mode. So put your camera in shutter priority mode and walk around and see what it does. I think that's the best way to learn this probably, is use the shutter priority mode, and that'll take a lot of the stress out of it. It'll let you just very quickly sample the effect that shutter speed has on your images. Digital makes this a lot easier because you see the effect instantly on the back of your camera right after you took it. So take advantage of the fact that you have instant feedback on a digital camera. There's a bunch more to learn. There's a bunch more to talk about. There's a lot of other settings we can talk about. I'm going to make different videos on each of those, but I want to keep each of these relatively short and relatively straightforward without getting too complex. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it entertaining. I hope you found it informative. I'll see you in the next one.